Hofstra Votes is a civic engagement campaign that was created to educate members of the campus and surrounding communities about political and policy issues and to encourage them to register and vote. Hofstra has a robust tradition of providing academic and experiential programs to learn about and participate in the democratic process, including being the only university to host 3 consecutive presidential debates. We'd like to welcome you to our Hofstra Votes podcast.
Welcome to the latest episode of our Hofstra Votes podcast. My name is Carla Schuster, and we are broadcasting from the studios of WRHU Radio Hofstra University. Today, we're going to talk about last night's Democratic presidential primary debate with Dr. Tomeka Robinson, a professor of rhetoric and coach of Hofstra's internationally acclaimed speech and debate team. Welcome, Tomeka.
Thank you for having me.
We're excited to talk to you about everything that we saw last night. I want to start with a pretty simple question, maybe not an easy one. Who won?
So I disagree with a lot of the commentators that have looked at last night's debate. And I think that the winners last night, honestly, were Buttigieg, as well as I am going to go with Julian Castro, former Secretary Castro. And I understand a lot of the commentary about how his gaffe with the Biden, and I'm sure we're going to talk about that in a few minutes, with Vice President Biden was a career ender, but I disagree with that. I think that it was misplaced, and it was, in fact, a gaffe. But I think that when he actually talked about his policy ideas, that they were coherent, they were clear, same thing with Pete Buttigieg, to where we understood a little bit more of what the appeal is of those candidates. Is it enough to move them into first place? Absolutely not. But I think that just looking at the performance last night, I think that Senator Warren wasn't as clear as she's been. She's lost some of that magic. Same thing with Senator Harris, is that I didn't see those moments that inspired me and wanted me to get behind them last night. Though overall, looking at their performances, I think that I still believe that they will stay in the positions that they're in.
That's really interesting because, as you noted, your feeling about who performed especially well last night is very different than what the punditry class has been saying. And for those of you out there who are not familiar with what happened, there was a moment early on in the debate where the candidates were talking about healthcare, and there was an exchange between Vice President Biden and Secretary Castro, in which Castro then looked at Biden and said, "Did you forget what you said just 2 minutes ago?" And the general consensus is that that was a moment where he was trying to point up Biden's age. He's 76. And remind folks how old he is and that perhaps he is not up to running for president. Now,
with that, I think that the ageism argument could cut both ways. I mean, because Biden was standing in between 2 other 70-year-old candidates, to where if it really was an age attack, then similar attacks would have been played against Senator Warren and against Senator Sanders.
There's also an opportunity to attack the frontrunner.
The frontrunner, exactly. I think that that's a more fair characterization as an attack against a frontrunner than an ageism.
Okay, that's a fair point.
And I think a lot of the commentary realize or forgets that ageism cuts both ways.
You and I have spoken before, and you are, as you say, a real policy person, and that, ironically enough, it's frustrating for you as a speech and debate person for folks to focus on performance over substance. Now, isn't it true, though, that Castro did what he did and sort of was looking for that moment with Vice President Biden, and he's looking for a way to have the viral moment that's going to help him raise enough money and generate enough interest in polls that he can continue in the field and on the debate stage when the Democratic National Committee raises the bar again, which will probably be at the end of October. So in that respect, yes, he performed well, but judgment. Right? I mean, isn't judgment an issue that you have to evaluate a president on? And was that the best judgment to go for that at that moment? It's basically a high-risk move, isn't it?
Yeah, I totally agree with you that this was a misplay by him in that moment. And yes, he was looking for those moments that get those sound bites, that get that attention to raise his profile, because people aren't really giving him the second and third look that is necessary to really propel him into the bigger conversation. So he was looking for those moments, and I think that you have to be strategic about when you use those moments. So that's why I said that while as you characterize, I am a policy matters person. I am a who gives me the best ideas, that should be the president. But for the general public who's not looking that deeply at policies and workability of policies and how they function, then it is something that is going to play into that conversation. So that's why it's not that I don't understand the critique that is being launched against him. I just disagree with the critique and the why of the critique, because I think it goes a little bit deeper than just it was a misplaced argument, because lots of people had misplaced moments. I mean, Senator Booker had a few of those, like, I'm going to go for the zinger that just fell flat throughout the night. And same thing with Senator Klobuchar. I think that she had some ideas that she was getting out there. And I think this was also the first time that we heard more of her and her ideas. But because it was kind of muddled and a little bit harder to follow, I think that those things also fell flat on people. It wasn't anything that's going to raise, if you weren't already a Klobuchar supporter before, you're not going to suddenly become a Klobuchar supporter because of her performance last night. Same thing with Castro, same thing with Senator Booker, and pretty much every other candidate that was on the stage last night.
Well, and that's a really interesting point, because and we haven't talked about this yet, this was the first debate in which we had it on one night. We had all the candidates on one stage together. There's still an awful lot of them, but they're all there together. There's the first time that Vice President Biden and Senator Warren were on the stage together and had an opportunity to debate each other, to the extent that that is even possible when you have that large a field. Do you think that change things? I mean, you've already said you don't think that this really moved the needle all that much in terms of how people will poll, but do you think it provided people with any more clarity? Did it change the dynamics on the debate stage beyond just, wow, there's only 10 of them and they're all on the same stage?
Well, I think that it's also important to point out there's still other candidates that are still running. They just didn't qualify for this debate. So they have not suspended their campaigns. They're still out there. I suspect most of them will probably suspend their campaigns in the next few days. Back to your point about getting the top 10 on that stage, because that's really what happened, is these are the top 10. These are the people that we should be focusing on and having everyone there. I think that it was a good opportunity to hear the difference between each of those candidates, but I don't know that any of them really did a good job of really setting themselves apart. I think that and that's why I argue that they're probably going to stay in the positions that they're in, though I could see a little movement of, some are Senator Sanders candidates or followers now hearing Senator Warren a little bit more, since now there's a little bit more of a contrast between them in place. But I don't see massive shifts on any of the polling numbers following this, just because none of them had those magic moments to really go clearer into those policy things outside of the candidates that I mentioned earlier,
right,
that I don't think that it's going to matter to a lot of people.
And you talk about having those magic moments. And it seemed to me in watching the debate that everyone had their applause lines ready. And as somebody who coaches debaters, rehearsal is a part of the process. And clearly folks had rehearsed based on what they thought would come up and what they thought might be asked, looking for those moments. I was thinking of, Amy Klobuchar. When Bernie Sanders has said in several debates, I wrote the bill, and this is related
and
to
she
ACA.
said, I read the bill.
Right. You may have wrote it, but I read it. And then she starts referencing page numbers. In general, how do you prepare but not sound rehearsed? What advice would you give to the candidates about creating those moments, and how do you do that? How do you rehearse but not sound stale?
Yeah, so I think that you raise a great point, especially when you use the word canning, because that's something that we certainly talk about during limited preparation events. So whether those individual events or in debate. So when it's those impromptu moments and stuff, to where, yes, you have some ideas. You've thought through some of these ideas, but extemporaneous delivery is what works. It's the most natural way to deliver information, as opposed to being memorized or canned, as you said. So it's one of those things that we talk about. You have some ideas of what you want to say, but don't rehearse it so much what those ideas are, to where you're sitting there and it becomes obvious to your audience that you're waiting for that moment to say those things or to get those things out.
I wanted to talk, and we were talking a little bit about this before we began, I wanted to talk about some performance issues and talk about verbal tics and hand gestures. Some things that I noticed, right? Biden seems to always sort of often says, look, folks. And Senator Warren seemed to start a lot of what she said with, let's be clear about this. And there's hand gestures. Elizabeth Warren tends to do some very specific things with her hands, and lots of hay has been made by many people, including President Trump, about Beto's hand gestures, Beto O'Rourke. I shouldn't just call him Beto. It's not as if we know each other. Do you, when you're coaching your students, do you coach them against doing things like that? Do you point out to them, hey, you know what, you're using this same sort of verbal intro of a sort, right? You're using these same phrases over and over again. You know what, your right hand is always doing this to the, over here, and you should stop it. Do you point that stuff out? Is that stuff a problem, or is it something that, humanizes a person? What's the coaching?
Yeah, so once I get my students, because again, as I've said, I'm a content matters person. So once we get the content down, we get the drafts out, we figured out the wording and everything, then yes, that's when we get into delivery coaching. And absolutely, if there's repetitive phraseology, if there are things, gestures that are very over gestury is what I call it, or if it's a weird gesture, I often record my students and show them, do you know that you're doing this? Because often we don't even realize that we are doing these repetitive things, or that we don't have as much control of our bodies as we think that we do. So I try to make my students to be more aware of their bodies when they're speaking, because it's not just about what you say, it's also how you say it, on whether or not that works to the audience. So delivery coaching is a huge part of our job. But again, as I said, I start with content first. I'm not going to just have you sounding pretty and not saying anything in the meantime.
So that's interesting, because it certainly appears to me that at this stage of the game, content, obviously content's important. I don't want to pretend that it's not, but that this is very much a performance-based situation right now. How would you coach candidates to balance the content and the performance? Because there's an argument that many pundits made that there was almost too much content. Well, they got, you don't want to get caught in the weeds, and that there was a lot of conversation early on about ACA, the Affordable Care Act, and Medicare for All, and that folks got really stuck in the weeds to the point where perhaps viewers' eyes glazed over and they switched channel. So you, as a content first person, as a policy first person, how would you coach these candidates at this stage to balance those two things?
So that is what frustrates me about a lot of the way that the structure of our debates are, because first of all, they're not real debates. They are at best town halls to where people are getting their ideas out. They're engaging with each other. They may engage with the question at some point, but it's not our true debate. So that's one of those things that kind of frustrates me as a debate coach, in that this is not a real thing. But as far as how to balance it, so one of the things is figuring out ways to make that content digestible. So making it, short, clear, concise, to where you still want the ideas out, because you don't want to completely dissuade someone like me who is sitting in the audience who's like, I need to hear more policy to distinguish who it is. But at the same time, yes, you do want to appeal to the overall population. You want them to be able to understand it. So that's why finding those digestible moments, finding language that easily translates to a general population. So it's not dumbing down the content, but it's making it more appealing.
That brings me to another thing I wanted to talk to you about related to Beto O'Rourke, who, based on the reviews of the early debates, people sort of felt he kind of faded into the background. And there was, when he ran against Ted Cruz for Senate and nearly won, a sort of Hollywood factor. People talked about his charisma, and that did not seem to translate early on in the first few debates. It struck me he seemed to find his mojo in this particular debate, talking about gun control, certainly based on the experience in El Paso, in his hometown. He seemed to have a certain passion and to do sort of organically some of the things that you just talked about. But you haven't mentioned whether you thought he had a good night. He's not one of the people that you pointed to, whereas many of the pundits seem to think that he kind of came into his own.
Yeah, so I think he did have a good night. I still would not put him as a winner because he was single issue. So he had that moment in that particular issue. And yes, he is an engaging and energetic, charismatic person. So I understand why he was doing well in Texas and kind of got, not just in Texas. I mean, he got a national appeal to where people were following a Senate race in Texas, to where it's very interesting to see that. But the reason why he hasn't gotten those moments in the other debates is that he really doesn't have ideas for a lot of these other things, to where he might interject some ideas here and there, but they're not really focused. They're not really thought out.
So he doesn't have
the
policy. You don't think he has the policy meat. He has the rhetorical talent and skills. And this just so happens because of this tragedy, it has kind of combined those two things for him in a way that you think works, but doesn't seem to work on other issues. That's your contention.
Yeah, that's basically my contention, is that it's missing some of those other things that we need. We need an all around. We don't need a single issue candidate. We need a candidate that's going to represent all of the American people and represent a lot of different interests and a lot of different ideas.
Do you think that anyone in the debate had a really awful moment? We've already talked about Secretary Castro, and we've talked about Andrew Wang and the strange joke. Was there anyone else among the front runners where there was a moment where you thought, oh man, that wasn't good?
Amongst the front runners, no. I think that they did what was expected. None of them had any awful gaffes or anything that would make people say, oh, I can't believe that this is what's happening. I do find it a little disturbing, some of the analysis that has come out about, Biden had a solid night and that's what we expected, and this is about all he needs. To where I think we're setting the bar too low, where as long as they don't say anything bad, they're just going to stay where they are. No, give me something good that's going to energize people who weren't already Biden or Warren or Sanders supporters. Give me something that's going to shift the needle in some way. And I just didn't see any of our front runners actually do that.
Interesting. You said you thought Biden had a better night.
And by better, I mean the bar is pretty low. The people who are calling it that he won the night just by showing up and not doing anything awful is really how I read a lot of that analysis. I think that that's setting it too low, and it's basically making the American people seem as if they're completely uninformed or uninspired by wanting more from a candidate. And I think it's okay to want more from a candidate that just doesn't mess up in a conversation.
So much of the conversation around 2020 is about who is electable and how do you combat Trump? How do you debate Trump? What would be your advice to a candidate on the Democratic side who was asking you that question?
Yeah, so it's very interesting. So if you are going after the audience that it is Trump supporters, if you're going after that audience, then you do need to be very careful that you're not talking over them. So where you're giving them information, so yes, you're talking about policy, but you're talking about it in a way that's understandable. So you're not giving so much information, just dumping a lot of facts and statistics at them. You're giving them narratives that they can follow. You're giving them, concrete ideas, but in a way that's digestible to the overall audience. As far as, how do they set themselves apart? Since, as you said, there are so many candidates. It's, making sure you are presenting your ideas in a way that resonates. So giving those sound bites, giving those things that can, make it into, the news the next day, those 30-second sound bites are so important, but that get people talking, but in the same way, not just giving just slogans, giving some content too. Content certainly matters when trying to set apart, which of these candidates should be the nominee for the Democratic Party.
So based on what you've seen so far, and I imagine you've been watching the debates fairly closely.
Yes, I've been watching all of them.
Who do you think does that well?
So I think that we have quite a few candidates, actually. I think that we can start, or we should start narrowing down the field to where people can start to get more information. Because when you have, 10 candidates on a stage at a time, it's really, really hard to get a lot of information or a lot of talking time between each candidate. But I think that Senator Warren does a fantastic job. Senator Sanders does a great job. Mayor Buttigieg, Kamala Harris. There's all of these candidates that are doing what they need to do to get those ideas out there. But that are giving us memorable ideas and giving us those moments where you're like, yes, this is what I want to see. And this is someone that, looks presidential, but can also go against President Trump.
Before we wrap up, is there anything that you wanted to say about what you saw last night that we haven't asked you about?
The only thing that I found really interesting, and I was really glad that the New York Times actually put it out right then. So at the very beginning, in those opening statements, when Andrew Yang, basically offered a sweepstakes, is the best way to frame that, is that it questions a lot of ethics of whether or not this is even plausible or if it violates campaign laws. And I think that's going to definitely change some of the conversation to where I still find the sweepstakes to be a bit of a scam, because it's to go to his website, sign up for his mailing list to basically show that he has more supporters in order to be eligible for this money. But whether or not the money can even be distributed and whether or not this is ethical, if it is for lack of a better word, political extortion in some ways to get people to come out and vote. Let me give you, 10 people $1,000 or 12 people $1,000 a month. It makes me question where we're going. If this is what the new political game is going to look like, and how does that fundamentally change our laws and our understanding of electoral politics?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, we're going to end today, as we always do, with a bullet poll where we ask our guest a couple of questions that may or may not be related to what we've been talking about. We're going to start with one that is related. Among political candidates, who would you say is the best debater in history?
From this current field?
No, just go back as far as you want. Who's the best debater among political candidates that you've ever seen? Television, whatever, right? In history.
I'm going to go to recent history, because now you put me on the spot. I'm going to go recent history and say President Obama.
Okay, and why?
Because he was able to do what I've said that I want to see. Have some policy ideas, have it out there, but clear, digestible, energizing, and charismatic.
Okay. One single piece of advice that you would give to President Trump to help him win a debate?
Back away from attacking individuals and groups of people.
But that's what's working for him. Right?
I know. You asked for me to win the debate with me as the adjudicator. He has to present real information and not attack people and give policy ideas. Now, to his base, like I said, that's working.
So what you're saying is that if he was in Berlin at the International Forensics Competition,
he would lose epically. Yeah.
Well, okay. And now, finally, for those of you who may not know, Tomeka is a real globetrotter. The more exotic the locale, the better. Am I right?
Yes.
So tell us, how many continents have you visited? How many states have you visited? And what's the dream trip, the bucket list place that you are desperate to see?
All right, so states. I'm up to 43 states, so I only have a few remaining, and I'm planning to check a few of these off soon. As far as continents, I have not been to Antarctica or Australia, but all the other continents I have touched.
There's a continent I've been to that you haven't?
Yes.
Wow.
So bucket list right now would be Australia. Simply because I need to check off another continent. I'm still not certain if I'm going to try to go for the full 7, although I do have a friend who has done the full 7. But I have to think about that one a little bit more.
Okay. So thank you to Tomeka Robinson for being with us today. This is the latest episode of our Hofstra Votes podcast. We will be doing several of these throughout the fall semester, talking to our own experts on campus, as well as some guest speakers we'll be bringing onto campus about various issues, both on the national and local political scene. The idea of the Hofstra Votes campaign, as we've said before, is to get people involved in the political process. And please, if you do nothing else, register to vote. With that, you can listen to any of our Hofstra Votes podcasts on Spotify, Google Play, iTunes, and Stitcher. In addition, if you need information about registering to vote, or you're looking for any other content related to the campaign, you can go to hofstra.edu/votes. If you have questions for any of our speakers that you would like us to pass along, please post them with the hashtag HofstraVotes. Thank you very much, and thank you once again to WRHU, Radio Hofstra University 88.7 FM for their hospitality, and we will be back again in another few weeks with our next episode of Hofstra Votes podcast.